Hi, I'm here with Peggy Peryam. Would you spell your last name for me, please?
P as in Peter, Eryam.
Okay, thank you.
Hello,
And
Nate.
hi. And this is a phone interview taking place at 6:45 p.m. I am on the campus of Hastings College, and you are in Peoria, Illinois, right?
East Peoria, north of East Peoria in Woodford County.
Thank you. And I'd like to start off by asking when and where were you born?
I was born April 28th, 1948, Battle Creek, Michigan.
Okay. So on to our first question. Before, during, prior to the Vietnam War starting, what was your awareness of the conflicts of Vietnam?
In high school, we learned about the conflicts in Vietnam and what was going on between the North and the South, and how the North was trying to take over the southern part of Vietnam, trying to impose their regime on them.
Okay. And then to go along with the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, what is your understanding of why the U.S. got involved in Vietnam?
To stop the North Vietnamese regime from overtaking the freer part of Vietnam, the South Vietnam.
Okay. And so, along with that, what were your experiences during the Vietnam War, and what did you do during the war?
I was married near the end of the war. I was in college during the war,
Okay.
high school and college.
Okay. And then during the war, how did you learn about or receive information, like through media or any sort of information? And then how did that change your perspective of the war?
My perspective originally was that the U.S. had a right to go in there and assist the South Vietnamese who could not be strong enough on their own. The U.S. was helping the South Vietnamese stay free, freer than they would have been with North Vietnam. My perspective did not change much, even though there were protests all over the college campus where I went, protests for us to get out of the Vietnam War. And then in 1968, before my husband and I were married, he enlisted in the Army. They had stopped exempting college students from the draft, and so he knew he was going to be drafted. So in order to avoid going where he didn't want to go, which would have been not working with heavy mechanics, he enlisted so that he would get into heavy mechanics school, heavy-duty truck mechanics school.
Okay.
And that was before we got married. So I supported the Army's effort, even though I had a few doubts about whether we should or should not be there.
Okay. And along with the mechanic school and your husband enlisting, where did his mechanic school take place?
His mechanic school took place in basic training, Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri.
Okay.
And then he had some other training in Washington, D.C. Then he was shipped to California to be sent to Vietnam.
Okay. And then what specifically heavy machinery did he work with throughout the war?
Oh, deuce and a half, 5 tons, 7.5 tons, 10 tons, trucks, mainly.
Oh, okay. And he was a mechanic, right?
Yes.
And since you were had a significant other in the war, did that affect the way you thought or and affect your experiences during the war?
That was kind of when I became aware again of God in my life, so that He could protect. I prayed so that He would protect Ken as Ken went over to Vietnam.
Okay. And then, is there any specific, most vivid memory that you have from the Vietnam time period?
Oh, probably too many to list here. I remember saying goodbye to my husband in August of 1969, and then I expected him to be gone for a year, and then Nixon started the pullback of troops in late August of 1969, and so my husband was reassigned to not go to Vietnam. He was reassigned to go to Colorado Springs. So, of course, there was a great deal of relief there, and relief that the Army considered the war basically over.
Okay. That's good. So Colorado Springs, did he have the same job there, working with the same sort of equipment?
Yes, he did.
Okay. And then moving on to the way soldiers were treated, do you think during and after the war did the soldiers, the veterans who fought, did they receive proper care and proper attention and receive proper recognition for what they did, in your opinion?
I'm going to answer that with another question.
Okay.
Recognition by whom, care by whom? To whom are you referring?
Recognition by the U.S. government or the U.S. Population, and then care if they were wounded. Did they receive proper medical care when they came back?
Okay, I can speak to that from experience. The people who we knew who came back from Vietnam were treated quite well by the government in their medical needs.
Okay.
The people, the general populace, was not as enthusiastic about the efforts of the Army people over there, and argued with the soldiers about why the soldiers even went into the Army and why they went over there.
Okay. And then along with this, with protests and everything going on during the war, what was the atmosphere of how the general population was feeling during the war?
It was mixed. That was when headlines, in my opinion, started to become more lurid and more sensational about what was going on, and more biased rather than objective.
Okay.
I noticed that with a lot of the newspapers, that they became more biased against the war, and they reported on what they felt was a gross amount of atrocities committed upon the South Vietnamese people by our people as well as North Vietnam.
Right. Okay. If you could explain the war in one word, what would it be, and then would you elaborate on why you chose this word?
Because of my experiences, I cannot state just one word about it. So I guess we'll have to bypass that question.
Yes, okay. That's fine. And then once the war was over, did life return to normal, or were some things permanently changed? Did it return to normal for the general population, the veterans coming home, and then just the government? Did things return to normal, or did things change?
The government's care of those returning was still evident. The government medical fields cared for the returning veterans. However, as science is always progressing and learning more things, and as emotions and mental behaviors are being studied and we're learning more and more, I believe there were some needs that were not met
Okay.
mentally. Boy, that's a tongue twister. Not met mentally for the soldiers who were returning, mainly because the general population and even the psychiatrists were not even aware of that type of a situation, like talking about post-PTSD and Agent Orange, the effects of Agent Orange. They were just discovering it. So the war, unfortunately, was a learning experience, but we're better off for that now, for having that learning experience.
Okay. And then, in your opinion, what do you think we could have done differently throughout the war? As in conflicts with the Viet Cong and then the South Vietnamese, and then just in general?
I don't believe I have enough head knowledge on that to state an accurate opinion.
Okay.
My impressions would just be my own impressions. But as I stated before, the news was transmitted much more quickly than, of course, news during World War II, so we were aware of everything that was going on.
Okay.
I'm not saying that we should have kept it a secret, but I'm just saying that influenced everyone's opinions and inflamed some people even more. Now, as far as what we could have done differently, I'm sorry. That's it. I can't answer that.
Oh, no, it's fine. And then along with the media, how did the media portray the war and the soldiers who fought in Vietnam?
That was a long time ago, Nate.
Okay.
The media was up to date on everything and up to the minute on breaking news.
Okay.
That was when communication from distant sources became much more refined.
Okay.
And up to the minute and up to date.
Okay. And then I'm gonna ask you now about the presidents involved. I know.
Okay. Can you call me back in 15 minutes about that part? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. I can do that.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks.
Yep.
Okay. Bye.
At this point, the interviewee had to take she had something come up, so that she asked me if I could call her back in a little bit. So I will pick up the recording when we call again. Alright, and now we are back. And as I was going to ask before, this section is about the U.S. presidents involved with the war. And so I know John F. Kennedy didn't have the biggest part to play in the war, but what did you think of how...
Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay, you were breaking up. Let me go into another room.
Okay, no problem.
Okay. All right, let's try it again. Okay, John Kennedy. But before Kennedy, there was Eisenhower.
Oh, yes.
Because the war started officially in 1954, the Vietnam War.
Okay.
So that would have been Dwight D. Eisenhower. And I was so little, I don't remember much of that. And I don't remember much of Kennedy.
Okay.
So were you going to ask me a specific question about Kennedy?
I was just going to say, I was just going to ask, what did you think of how Kennedy handled his involvement with the war? But since you don't remember that much, I can move on to President Johnson and how, with the same question, and how he handled things and what he could have done differently.
I should have been more aware of Johnson, of what he did, but really, I don't remember much about what he did except sending the troops over there. He did not seem to publicize it very much in my remembrances.
Okay.
But then the next president, Nixon, seemed like he had headlines all over the place.
Yes.
About the Vietnam War. But again, that could be because I was older and more aware at that time.
Okay. And then after the war, what did you think of President Nixon and how his so-called legacy would affect the presidency?
Well, I didn't feel like Watergate had anything to do with Vietnam. I felt they were two different issues.
Okay.
But it did not make me doubt that what he did was in Vietnam was right or wrong. I probably didn't even think about it. I was just what he did with Watergate.
Okay.
That was his downfall. But I don't relate it to anything before that.
Okay. And then I'm not sure if I asked this before, but upon the soldiers returning home, how did
Okay, before that,
Yes.
did you want Gerald Ford was also president during part of that time?
Oh well, then yeah, that's of course. I'd love more information.
Yeah, he was a peacemaker in it and slowing things down even more, sending fewer and fewer troops over, and trying to reintegrate normalcy in South Vietnam, which I don't think still has occurred to this day, but they're content. So, okay, back to your other question.
Okay. And then so upon returning home, from the war, how did those who protested the war, and how did the veterans coming home, in your opinion, how did they interact when the soldiers came home?
I think their initial interactions were probably acrimonious. I don't think there was any love lost between the two sectors. But as time went on and other things involved people's lives and new wars came up, like the two Gulf Wars,
Right.
I think people just changed their focus and protested on something else.
Okay. And then why do you think we should worry or care about the Vietnam? In other words, what did the Vietnam teach us, and what is its legacy to us?
Good question. Vietnam taught us about caring for other nations, and yet it also taught us that we as the United States cannot fix everything.
Okay.
And there are some places where we should not be involved in. Now, fortunately, I'm not one of the people who has to make the decision whether we involve ourselves in it or not. Obviously there are hot spots now,
Right,
where we're debating our involvement, Aleppo and Syria, and the latest one on the banks of Israel.
Yes.
So all of those are just the current topics, and I think once they're over, people let them go.
Okay. And then back to more towards the Vietnam War. After the war, and with the information you've heard about the war, starting at the end of the war up till now, how's that information you've come to know, how has that changed your view on the war, or has it changed your view on the war?
On specifically the Vietnam War?
Yes, just the Vietnam War.
Okay. I feel kind of sad that it had to be such a learning ground for psychiatry and for medical conditions. They were just beginning to be diagnosed from there. People in the Gulf Wars, the psychiatrists were so much more aware of what went on in the soldiers' minds because of the experiences of those in the Vietnam War. So it was a learning ground, but it was a very sad learning ground that had to happen.
Okay. The next question I had was, what comparisons can you make between Vietnam and World War II, or even the more modern wars such as the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq?
There are several different dynamics going on in each of those different wars. Many more nations were involved in World War II on a wider scale
Right.
than in any of the wars since then. That's the main difference.
Okay.
Many nations joined together. In the Vietnam War, yes, other nations did join with the Americans there, but there was not a general jumping on board of nations as there had been in World War II. The Gulf Wars were even more fragmented. Yes, different nations sent their forces over, but it was not as large a war, and neither was Vietnam, as World War II.
Okay. Let's see. I'm trying to think if there are any other questions I have. Here's one. What lessons did you learn that you think everyone should take away from the Vietnam War? What lessons have you learned from the war that you think everyone should take away from it?
Oh, it's so easy to have a laissez-faire attitude, a let-it-be attitude, and let them fight their own battles over there. The current experiences have taught us that there are times we should not be involved. But being a nation ourselves of trying to establish peace, and of course, as our Constitution says, liberty, the right to bear arms, and all of the other parts of the Constitution, the preamble and the Constitution, we feel compelled, much as missionaries, to bring that attitude to other places and other nations and help them out. So as far as long-term lessons, I think it's a dichotomy.
Okay.
So the laissez-faire people, as well as the people who want to help ensure the rest of the world has freedom.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions I have for you. So, do you have any final thoughts on the war that you would like to say?
Yes, I want to ask you a question.
Okay.
From your perspective of the interviews that you have done so far,
yes.
How has that changed your opinion of a war during which you were not even alive?
I would say that being from the millennial age where everything is very, if it's not here and now, it doesn't matter. I feel like I need to research more and get a better understanding of what happened and why everything happened, instead of just taking like blockbuster movies versions of what happened for that. I need to do more research and research in depth as to the causes and what we could have done differently and how that's changed the American perspective on wars even up to now.
Okay, is that something you feel compelled to pursue?
I think so, yes. This class was focused on the Vietnam War, and it's a war I didn't know much about going into the class. And as we're coming towards the end of this class, and with the interviews I've done, it's made me feel like I need to do more research so I can better understand the war.
Okay. Did you know that some of the recent history books have changed some of the facts that actually had occurred there?
I was not aware of that.
Yeah. Texas was one state that refuted some of the new history texts that were presented to them for approval for their state board of education.
Okay.
And they rejected some of them because even though the war was 60 years ago,
right.
Well, not even 60 years ago, they felt some facts had been changed.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Yeah, that's something I think I should research more upon and see why they're doing that and as to why they feel compelled to do that instead of them doing their own research and making sure they have their own facts instead of just refuting things.
Yeah. You have to make sure that the history books are history and not Wikipedia.
Right. Right. Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I don't have any of Ken's notes from back then. I have some letters he sent me from things that went on post at Fort Carson.
Okay.
And activities that he did there. And of course, we talked on the phone a lot about when he was going to go to Vietnam and when he was recalled and not sent to Vietnam. So
Okay.
I keep some of those letters around. It was a personal time for me.
Yeah.
Well, part of it was because I was little in 1954 when it started, and in about 1975 when it ended, Ken was out. But we still had friends who were in the Army participating in it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for taking this time to answer my questions and setting aside this time to talk to me. This has been really helpful for me. So, thank you.
Oh, you are welcome. How many more interviews do you have?
This was actually the last one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Of how many?
We were required to do 2.
Only 2? Oh, my.
Yeah. I feel like I should... Oh, I was going to interview Nana, but she directed me towards you instead.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like any information that I could gather, even if it's not, as she said, the most helpful, I feel like any information, even if it's minuscule, is helpful for everyone, including me.
Yeah.
So.
Well, you tell your professor in my high school history classes, they're required to interview 3.
Okay.
So you're getting off easily.
Okay. I will pass that along.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Nate. Okay. Bye.
Bye.